Hello. I was in the process of organising an event at the weekend that was going to explore ancient Greek mythology and religious ideas, beliefs, cultural customs for various friends. But due to conflicting things going on at the same time, I had to reschedule it. One of the elements of what we were going to look at was issues connected to the philosophy of ethics and ideas around ancient Greek ethics, both what they tell us about life in ancient Greece, but also to what extent they have value, meaning an influence upon modern society and modern day people, regardless of whether we're talking about adherents of the ancient gods or atheists, Christians, Jews, Hindus, whatever, who might nonetheless find a lot of interest and worthwhile study in looking at ancient Greek ideas. So I thought it would be perhaps of interest to some listeners to share some of these ideas, and you can kind of chip in through the comment section at your own thoughts on these issues. And this was going to blend a little bit of Roman ideas with Greek ideas and sort of making comparisons between the two. And so revisiting something I used to teach years ago, which is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is primarily something that comes to us from the Greeks, although other civilizations have comparable notions, comparable ideas. Virtue ethics is the idea that there are certain key behaviors and accompanying states of mind that underpin those behaviors. If you want to put it in modern parlance, you might think of the sort of cognitive behavioral interconnections. The state of mind leads to the behaviour, possibly sometimes the other way around. So you can't completely winnow out what's in here from what you do. There is an interlinking. And that in virtue ethics, if you've got the right virtuous states of mind and the behaviours that arise from those states of mind, then most moral dilemmas will resolve themselves. So whereas in some systems of thought, you have a big long list of thou shalt not do this, thou must do that, guiding people through various dilemmas and issues. What do we do if so and so situation crops up? And a particular religion or philosophy will say, well, according to the sacred book, according to the great teacher, you should do this or you should not do that. And there will be a list of situationally specific guidelines. The notion of virtue ethics is that you don't really need to tie specific answers to specific situations. You just present people with a general guideline. Here is how to have a virtuous life, a decent life, which is a concept, and we're going to do the usual high tech N bit with bits of cheesy paper. It's the term the Greeks used was eudaimonia, that having of a good life, a morally desirable life. Not just good in the sense of a fun life, a happy life, an exciting life, because it's not really, eudaimonia is not really about happiness in the modern sense. You could live a perfectly eudaimonic life without being in fits of ecstatic joy every 30 seconds. Your life might be fairly, well, not dull, but fairly straightforward, going on an even keel emotionally without mad highs and potentially terrible lows. Because when it says a good life, it means a morally desirable life. That you live the life of a good person, of a decent person who does the right thing by other people, and certainly within virtue ethics. So it's not just abstract ideals, it's very much situated in community. The notion of this is how you treat other people. And most of the time, what the ancient Greek philosophers were talking about was other human beings. Well, were they? There's a question. Often it was other human beings within specific contexts. Ancient Greek laws of the different city-states, Boeotia and Athens and Sparta and so on, didn't necessarily define every living, breathing individual as a human being worthy of being treated in a certain way, because you had slave-owning cultures and very variant attitudes to foreign nationals. So be they merchants or travellers or whatever they might be, arriving in a Greek city, if they were not a resident of that Greek city, they wouldn't necessarily be accrued the same status, the same moral virtue, same legal status or virtue as a native of the city-state. So when I say how to treat other human beings in ancient times, that was often somewhat constricted to certain specific types of people. And coming back to this issue that I mentioned at the start, if we're thinking how this informs us today, obviously we have a much broader notion. Well, most of us do, although some events in world history at the moment suggest that obviously there's sizable chunks of the human population that don't think in the way I was just about to say, that most of us have a much broader definition of what constitutes a person today than a lot of ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, etc., 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 would have had several thousand years ago. For one thing, we obviously no longer have a legal slave caste, by which I mean, obviously, slavery does go on. We keep hearing horror stories in the news about people being kept as slaves in various dreadful conditions, but it is done illegally. There is no legal conception of permissible slavery. So we don't have those kinds of attitudes. We view men and women in very different ways, both in terms of the relationship between the sexes, but also in terms of social class. A lot of the ancient world was quite snobbish. The philosophers came from the upper classes. They were educated in order to be able to write their books. I'm sure there's plenty of working class people perfectly capable of philosophising down the tavern after a few bevies, but most of them couldn't read, couldn't write. So they never got to put their ideas to paper, and so we these days only get to read the ideas of the well-heeled. We don't get to read the ideas of the impoverished at the bottom rung of society. And certainly the ideas of the upper classes do often reflect a fair amount of class snobbery in the way they view each other. Posh on posh, if you like, is not necessarily the way they view the lair orders. They had a tendency to look down their nose a bit at the manual labourers in the world around them and regard them in a somewhat different light. And I'd like to say we don't do that anymore. I kind of feel I might have a Pinocchio moment here, and my nose might start growing if I say that. Clearly we still do have quite a lot of snobbery in the world, but possibly not quite as much as they had in the ancient world. This is getting very convoluted, isn't it? But the notion of what constitutes a good life today, a eudaimonic life, I suspect is something we would, most of us at any rate, would want to be available to everyone. Not just ourselves, not just people of the same sex as us, not just people of the same religion as us, not just people of the same social class as us. We'd want men and women, people of different ethnicities, different religions, different nationalities. Forget all of those borders and barriers that divide us up into demographic subsections. Most people, I suspect, I hope, would think, if I can have a good life, everybody else should be able to have a good life as well, rather than sort of restricting the definition of a good life as something only available to a certain type of person. So there's been this sort of democratization of the notion of eudaimonia, which perhaps wasn't terribly widespread in the ancient world, and that's, I think, is a good thing. It's an advancement that we've spread the notion of just about everybody having at least the hope of a good life, even if they don't necessarily always have the means to go about achieving it. And that's something we do owe, I feel, to Christianity, and the notion of individual salvation, that each individual soul was worthwhile, not just the souls of the rich or the well-educated or the aristocratic or whatever, but the souls of everybody, all the way down to Flossie the milkmaid and Fred who shovels the dung out of the stables, that all and sundry should or do have a soul rather, and should have the opportunity to have their soul salvaged, make its way to heaven. Very Christian idea, not an idea that was particularly current at all in the ancient world. Not that they were necessarily condemnatory of the uneducated or the working class or whatever, just that they didn't really think much about them in the first place. There was, I say, books written by the very well educated, the very well heeled, chiefly to be read by other very well educated, very well heeled people. They were writing for an audience very similar to themselves, and they weren't giving an awful lot of thought to the very large sections of society back then who couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't afford the books in the first place. So the fate of the working man and the working woman was not given a lot of thought back then, let alone the fate of slaves or the unfree. But these days we'd, I hope, extend the opportunity for eudaimonia to all and sundry. Now, part of having a good life, as I say, is to have a virtuous life, a morally desirable life in which you exhibit the qualities of human decency. Now, there isn't a fixed list as to a precise number, like for example, within Catholicism, if I can even pronounce the word properly, you have the notion of the 7 virtues, as well as the 7 deadly sins. There are 7 virtues. So there is a set of a fixed number of notions. You don't get that from ancient Greece. You get themes that crop up a lot. References to certain virtues appear more commonly than to other virtues, but it isn't a sort of a fixed numerical number. It'd be quite nice if it was 12, because you've got the 12 Olympians, and that would tie nicely if you could associate with that, but it doesn't pan out like that. So in what would have been the meeting on Saturday, I just sort of culled a small number, because it wasn't going to be a long meeting, a small number of virtues to talk about. There are other virtues out there. So this is by no means a comprehensive or exhaustive list. This is just what I wanted to talk about. And a good starting place, I think, is the concept of arete. Now, it's often linked, not wholly accurately, I think, personally, to the Roman concept of virtus. Now, there are some similarities between arete and virtus, but they're not wholly the same thing, in that virtus has a bit more of a gender basis to it. It stems from the root word vir, man, and it means to be manly. Now, it was quite possible for some Roman writers to indeed talk about manly women, not in the sense of being butch and stomping around in sensible shoes, but exhibiting the same desirable moral traits as men were expected to exhibit. And again, when I say men, wheeling back in the same qualifications, chiefly what we were talking about is the ancient, highly educated, wealthy ancient Romans, the patricians, writing about the virtues of other patricians, not about the virtues they expected to see in the plebeians or in the slaves or whatever else. So this was adult men writing about the virtues they expected to see in other wealthy adult men. To be full of virtus is to be quite manly in the warrior sense, a sort of brave, courageous, fierce, dynamic, honourable, which is perfectly possible for ancient Roman women to exhibit those qualities, as indeed women of any other period of history or culture. Arete was a bit more across the board. It wasn't a kind of a thing especially associated with men or especially associated with warriors. Anyone could aspire to arete. So it was a bit more broad spread than the Roman notion. And it's not quite the same thing as the sense of bravery and fierceness and that sort of martial warrior strength that comes with virtus. Arete is excellence, really, more than anything else. That whatever it is that you do it to the best of your ability. Now, that could be, in ancient Greek terms, if you are a general in the Athenian army, you are the best general you can possibly be. But equally, it could be that if you are a basket weaver, you're the best basket weaver you can be. If you are a potter, you make the best pots you can possibly make. A key point here is that this is best you can be, rather than better than everybody else, because therein lies the risk of what might loosely be called a sinful behaviour, if we were using Christian terminology, of hubris, in that hubris is a form of extreme arrogance in which you aspire to be better than everyone else and kind of lord it over them. Especially dangerous if you aspire to be better than the gods. And the Greek myth is full of stories of rather silly people who said that they were more beautiful than the gods, braver than the gods, wiser than the gods, better at weaving than the gods, etc., etc. And one or other irate deity turned up and said, "Right, if you think you're so damn good, pow!" and visited some rather awful fate. As with the weaving example I've just mentioned there, when Arachne, the weaver, says she is better at weaving than Athena, the goddess, one of whose domains is the ability of weaving. Athena, not a goddess you want to cross, not that, frankly, there's any goddesses you want to cross, but Athena is not renowned for her forgiving and tolerant nature in that sense. So she turns up and zaps Arachne and turns her into a spider, and effectively says, "Right, mush, weave that then." And for the rest of eternity, Arachne has to weave webs rather than weaving cloth. So yes, hubris is an excess of excellence when it goes beyond being your best to being better than everybody else, which is vanity, arrogance, pride, overweening egotism, and it's probably a reason why pride, superbia in the Latin, is part and parcel of the Catholic 7 deadly sins. A kind of self-adulation that puts yourself above as more important than your relationship with the divine. It's quite often used actually these days, I was going to say briefly, for some slightly mad reason, mostly because somebody else had dropped out of the job and they were desperate. Many, many years ago, I was asked to teach a module on sports psychology. I'm about the least sporty person you could imagine. Got no interest in sports whatsoever. So it was a bit, blind leading the blind, me trying to teach people about sports psychology. But a popular feature of modern day sports psychology is this notion of what is essentially arete, in that you if you're a coach or a sports psychologist or whatever you are, you say to your athlete that you're giving your pep talk to, if they're a marathon runner, sprinter, whatever, what was your speed last time you ran this? Okay, right, let's try and get you to beat your speed last time. So they're not trying to beat any of the other runners. They're trying to beat their own previous record. If it was a footballer, rather than trying to beat the other team, you'd say, well, how many goals did you score last time? Right, let's see if we can get you to score more goals this time. Regardless of whether the whole team wins or loses, have they improved their own basic performance from last time? I suppose if they're a goalie, you might say to them, well, can we get you to deflect more goals than you deflected last time? Or whatever. Not that I know anything about football, but you get the gist. So the goal is not to say be better than everyone else, be the winner, beat the other teams, grind them into the dirt, but rather to say be better than you were yourself last time you did this activity. And you can apply that rationale to all sorts of things, not just to sports psychology, all sorts of things, where instead of trying to do other people down, you're trying to improve upon yourself, to be better at whatever it is that you do. And as a guideline in life, whether you put this into a working employment context, or to do with hobbies and skills, or whatever, you are seeking to have a greater sense of accomplishment than you had last time, which there is a bit of a movement, particularly in some artistic circles, to suggest that if you can hear a noise, that's the ice cream van outside. To say that if you're a painter or a singer or whatever, you don't have to be good at painting or good at singing. You should just paint or sing or do whatever your artistic expression is, to enjoy it. So you could be a really crap painter, but as long as you enjoy being a painter. You could be the world's worst singer, but as long as you enjoy singing, that's the main thing. That's not something that I suspect the Greeks would have gone along with. Not that they were anti-joy, anti-taking pleasure in your own abilities and your own activities, but rather they would say, well, could you paint a picture that's a bit better than the picture you painted last time? Could you sing a song that's a bit more in tune than you sang it last time? Not that you have to be a dazzlingly good singer or an astoundingly amazing artist, but just that the level of your work is getting a little better and a little better and a little better each time you do it. So you are attaining arete, and you are becoming a more invested person. You could put it in a sort of slightly Buddhist context and think of mindfulness, in that it is kind of about being present in the activity that you're doing, not just doing a slapdash job and oh, that'll do kind of mentality. It's rather to say, in this moment I am doing this activity. I am baking a cake, I am painting the walls, I am hoovering the carpet, whatever it may be. Can I do this activity well? Can I, not that I necessarily enjoy hoovering the carpet or painting the walls or whatever, but can I do it well? Efficiently, effectively, get it done, make a good job of it. And even if you've got a job, if we put it in the employment context, that maybe you don't much like your boss or whoever, or it's not a very good wage packet, there's all sorts of things you don't like about it, you'd really like to be doing a totally different job somewhere else, but in that moment you are doing that job, and it's about being in that moment and present in your life and focused on what you're doing and acknowledging that it's important to you, not necessarily to your manager, not necessarily to the woman next door, to you, to do that task well. To give it your full attention, to give it your full effort, your full focus, your full set of resources. And that's part of what brings about this state of eudaimonia, this good life, is that you're present in it, you're focused on it, you're giving it your best, you're not just kind of falling out of bed every morning and doing a half-assed job and then falling back into bed at the end of the day, barely engaged in your own life. You are present in the moment. You are in your life, invested in your life. We could link this into various German philosophers, but we won't. But there have been not dissimilar ideas from within German philosophy about being in the world, in the moment, in that present time where you are. Just as a brief mention, having said virtus from the Roman point of view is very much tied up with the notion of masculinity, you might be wondering, what's the feminine version? It is pudicitia. Now, pudicitia, or I think that's how you pronounce it, could be doesn't matter. My Latin isn't terribly good. It sometimes translates as modesty. The Greek equivalent is eidos. To be modest was seen as a particularly feminine thing, and obviously we could tie ourselves up in knots about sexist issues and so on. Sometimes the word is linked to the concept of shame, and there is like it or not like it, there is an interlinking between notions of modesty and notions of shame in language and many cultures around the world, where dressing modestly in quite a few cultures, by whatever definition of modesty happens to be present in that culture, is often encouraged for both sexes, but often more so for women than it is for men, in that an immodestly dressed woman is often likely to get more aggro than an immodestly dressed man will go. I mean, they'll both get disapproval, but one will tend to get rather more disapproval than the other, because it is seen as a more feminine quality. But again, just as there were Roman women who were praised for exhibiting virtus, so there was an expectation on Roman men that they too should exhibit modesty in this sense. Particularly in public, it's seen as a very public virtue, so it's not so much what you do at home with the front door shut and the curtains drawn, it's rather what you do when you're out in public, how you dress, how you behave, how you talk to people. Um, it's about not just not showing too much flesh, and worth bearing in mind in a significant difference between the Romans and the Greeks. Um, as you will notice from a lot of Greek art, nudity was very commonplace. The body beautiful. You got these stunningly beautiful male and female statues of gods and warriors and maidens and whatnot. Nudity was seen as a beautiful thing. The very early Olympic Games were engaged in naked. You had an all-male Olympic Games and then slightly later an all-female Olympic Games, with an all-male audience and an all-female audience accordingly. To the Roman mind, nudity was in public was a rather shameful thing that was mainly associated with slavery. That slaves for sale on the market were stripped naked so that the buying public could see if they were diseased, if they were well fed or half starved, if they were big and burly for heavy manual jobs, or if they were covered in whip marks because they were seen as very disobedient slaves or whatever. So the nudity was part of the marketing process, if we can put it like that. So for the Roman, it was one thing if you were at home and you were walking around with not very much on, or you were down the Roman baths. Obviously, you'd get undressed for the baths. But in public, before the eyes of general strangers, the idea of being naked was a very shameful thing. It suggested you were robbed of your dignity, robbed of your power, your status, your barrier against the world around you. And so there is this notion of both the sexes having to maintain a sense of propriety. And that's, I suppose, a lot of what it is, a sense of propriety, of behaving in a proper and appropriate way in a given social circumstance. Which is a concept that has remained current in many, many cultures around the world to the present time. Not every culture, clearly, but many cultures have maintained that as a concept, as an idea of proper, appropriate, respectful. And it is both respectful of others, but also respectable, earning the respect of others, behaviour. Not just in terms of dress, but how you behave, whether you're polite to people, whether you remember to use formal language when addressing a social superior, or whether you're too familiar and oi mate in it to people you should be talking to in a very respectable and slightly formalised manner. So it's the demonstration of those sorts of behaviours. And the expectation for the Greeks with eidos and it is quite similar to the Roman notion of pudicitia. That there should be respectful behaviour, respectful dress, although the Greek notion of what constitutes respectful dress differs from the Roman notion, but the behavioural notions are quite similar. In public, and that does include not only to your social superiors, but to the gods, to the realm of spirit that it has to be interacted with in a sort of appropriate fashion. Formality in some parts of the world is sort of declined almost to the level of non-existence. Although I did notice that a lot of people who don't normally care about such things did get a bit shirty when Donald Trump was still president and came over to see the Queen as she was at the time, and was a bit sort of hands-on, a bit matey with her and kind of walking ahead of her rather than walking side by side with her when they were on some public thing. I think they were inspecting a guard of honour or something like that, and there were people going, "Oh, how very dare he!" It shows disrespect to put a hand on the Queen, to step out in front of her. He was sort of often being a bit lambasted as being rather crass and vulgar and what have you. So we all went a bit terribly Victorian all of a sudden when it was convenient, and then immediately forgot about it when it comes to other celebrities and prominent people who we don't mind being extremely informal and engaging in all sorts of quite crass behaviour. Double standards. But yes, I suppose even in a society which has mostly let its standards of propriety go to the wall, occasionally they do resurface and are exhibited as something that has to be lived up to and sustained in all sorts of ways. Having mentioned the gods, there is the notion of Eusebia from the Greeks. The Roman equivalent is pietas, in which we have a duty towards the gods, towards the ancestors, the spirits, the realm of spirits in general, to behave in an appropriate fashion, but also towards other living human beings, because piety or Eusebia is as much to do with our relationships with the living as with the supernatural. That, as with many cultures around the world, there is a sense of reciprocal duty that we owe certain people, parents, grandparents, etc., a duty of care to provide them with help and support, particularly as they get old and frail. But that at a younger age, the parents have a duty of care to their children. So there's all sorts of individuals to whom there is a duty of reciprocity, that you treat them in a certain way, they have to treat you in a certain way. And if that social contract, to put it in Hobbesian terms, is disrupted, one half of the party doesn't live up to the social expectations on them, it creates disharmony and disruption. And nobody quite knows where they stand anymore. So if you don't honour your gods, do your gods have to look after you? Or your next of kin or whatever else? If you violate your family relationships, do those relatives owe you anything? Or continue to owe you anything if you don't live up to your half of the sense of duty? If you don't pay your taxes, does the person in charge of the country have to look after you if you've not chipped in? Because again, can be financial duties as well as behavioural duties, as well as all sorts of other duties of reciprocity that have to be lived up to. And failure to do so is considered really quite dangerous in a lot of ways. And it's not about liking, it's not about having any degree of affection towards the people. I mean, you might like them, you might well do, but equally, even if you don't like them at all, you still owe them a duty of reciprocity, that you have to treat them in a certain way and they are expected to treat you in a certain way. And there is, within both the Greek, the Roman, and quite a few of the other similar cultural approaches, a notion of what should we say, of not being a doormat, that if you become aware that the other party is not treating you well, they're not fulfilling their side of the bargain, and you do nothing about it, you just go, oh dear, and put up with it and allow that other person to take advantage of you, then you yourself are at fault as well as them being at fault. Because this kind of reciprocity has to be a two-way street and enforced in both directions. I don't mean enforced in a nasty way, but just sort of prompted, encouraged, whatever you want to call it. And so if you're allowing other people to be exploitative, then it's not just them that's being a bit of a shit. You are also being silly, foolish, in allowing them to get away with it and allowing them to do it. You should, bring them to a call of order. So that's something worth bearing in mind. An element of that is xenia, which is our duty of hospitality, particularly towards people we don't know. Duty to strangers. Xenia comes from the word for stranger. Zeus was one of his titles is the god of strangers, the god of travellers. That we have certain duties towards people who come to us as visitors. So that could be somebody who knocks on your door that you don't know from Adam and they're asking for help or whatever. It could be more commonly in the ancient world someone who comes to the gates of your city as a stranger and seeks help and seeks aid. Now, it will be very easy, especially with global situations of migration and all of the news items about people fleeing from one country to go to another country to get very carried away with this and put a very modern spin on it, and perhaps assume that the duties of Xania are bottomless. They're not in the ancient conception of it. You owe certain duties, but that doesn't mean you have to be drained dry or give aid to people who are not reciprocating. Because, like Eusebia, there is a reciprocity here. That just as there is host law, so there is guest law. It has to be a two-way street. So if you offer hospitality to someone who then violates the hospitality, you no longer owe them anything. In fact, you probably owe them a kick up the bum. So it's a mutual understanding. This is something that is reflected in a lot of cultures. Things like the Havamal, for example, which is a poem said to have been spoken by Odin. And there's a lot of verses in the Havamal. Some of them talk about guest law and talk about host law and how to be a good guest in other people's houses, how to be a good host when you are welcoming people into your house. It's a two-way street. It's a mutual expectation. And as the Havamal itself states, it doesn't go on forever. So you can have the guest who overstays their welcome. You invite them for dinner and all of a sudden it's 4 a.m. and they're still bloody well there. The fact that you've got your pyjamas on and you're half asleep on the sofa, they haven't taken the hint and gone home. They are violating the social contract of the guest and exploiting the host. And there's all sorts, whether it's just somebody comes to your house for dinner or a whole bunch of people turn up on the shores of your country saying we're fleeing war, we're fleeing earthquakes, whatever it is we're fleeing, can we have refuge here? Whatever level it's at, there is a point at which the hospitality only goes so far, and then it shifts into a different understanding, a different dimension. If it's seen to be exploited or taken advantage of in some capacity. I'm not going to get bogged down in the politics of modern day situations, but the nature of these sorts of virtues is that they're not endless. They're meant to be applied in a restrained manner. And as Aristotle himself pointed out, too much of anything is not a good thing. All things in moderation, as the temple at Delphi had inscribed upon the wall, that there must be balance in all things. So with any of these virtues taken to excess, they become unhealthy, they become dangerous, they become destructive. And equally taken to too little, someone who has too little arete, too little Xania, too little whatever, is equally as problematic as somebody who has too much. It's a bit like Goldilocks and the porridge. You've got to get it just right, not too hot, not too cold, just right, to find that balanced middle path to make it a harmonious thing, a positive, beneficial force rather than a destructive one. I realise I'm rambling all over the place with this. I should have thought of a more structured way of going about this before starting on it. So I think I'll draw this to a close now, and there were some other virtues I was going to explore, but I could always do those in a separate recording and perhaps have it a bit more focused and structured than this one, such as the concepts of justice, for example, which I was going to reflect on as well, on the concepts of kinship and family. But we'll leave that for another day and see if there's any feedback to this and any sort of thoughts upon how relevant this is to modern living, whether you have an interest in the Greeks or not at all, but nonetheless you might find the ideas of use to understanding better ways of living, better ways of improving the situation. But just to conclude, and going back to that notion of virtue ethics, if you have these qualities, these traits, the idea is that they should resolve situations. Now, where it gets a little bit unclear, and certainly if we were delving into the realm of medical ethics, there is a form of virtue ethics argued by two modern-day philosophers, Beecham and Childress, within the realm of medical ethics, where they give a set of values and say this is the values that doctors and nurses and dentists and psychiatrists and what have you should be operating their work by. But what they don't say is a pecking order for these values. So that there are quite a few situations where medical professionals might find themselves in a bit of a quandary, a bit of a crossroads, where if they go down one route of following one virtue, they're contradicting another virtue in the process. And they can either do A or they can do B, but they can't do both A and B at the same time. And that situation is also true of virtue ethics in general, not just in the medical sense, that you can have a set of values, but you may sometimes find yourself in a situation where you're thinking, well, do I do this value or do I live by that value? Because I can't do both at the same time in this specific situation. What you don't get is a guideline from the Greeks as to which of these values takes precedent over the others. So if you're in a conflict between value A and value B, do you stick with virtue A or do you go with virtue B? That's not clear. So I'm not suggesting this is a perfect solution for the ideal eudaimonic life, only that this is an understanding of ways to approach modern living, as well as understanding how people approached ancient living. Thank you.